So while leveling, you are going to encounter a lot of green items, and this leads to one of the most common questions in WoW Classic. What green items are good and I am going to be able to sell, and what green items are absolute garbage? Now, I'm not going to be able to tell you conclusively for every item which is which, but hopefully in today's video we'll be able to give you some sort of an idea as to being able to see for yourselves what a good green and what a bad green look like. So let's go in. Now first things first, what are we actually going to do with these greens once we've established whether they are good or bad? Now this is entirely up to you. But what I would say is that any good greens you are either going to want to be using or you're going to want to be selling. Personally, I get enough bind on pickup greens and blues from running dungeons and doing my questing that I don't personally feel as though I ever need to equip a BOE green that I get. So generally if I get a BOE green, it goes on the auction house if it is good. Now, when it comes to the bad BOE greens that you're going to be getting, you do have a couple of options. If you are an enchanter, then chances are you're going to want to disenchant the green and either sell the materials or use them for a good enchant, or even just sell them for other people that are leveling up their enchanting. Or alternatively, you may not have access to enchanting, at which point then chances are what you're going to want to do is vendor the item. Now you're never going to want to delete items because obviously gold is hard to come by in Classic, and there is no reason to throw away these items which can have very good vendor values. Now in some cases you can get items that even at low levels are worth multiple of gold to a vendor, but are absolute garbage that no one's ever going to want, so please do vendor your greens, do not delete them. That is tip number one. Now, when it comes to identifying good and bad greens, sometimes it's incredibly simple, so I'm actually going to throw some examples up on the screen for you here. So, on the left we have the Scarlet Wrist Guards. Now, these come from Scarlet Monastery, and as well as being a decent enough green item in themselves, they are part of the set that many people do want to collect. It's an early form of getting hit rating, as well as the fact that a lot of the other parts of the set at this level you simply can't get better than. Beyond that, the fact that they are a set and are simply something that, sets being something that people like to collect, whether it's good for them or not, people want tier sets, they want entire transmog sets and things of that nature. These are going to sell for a good value and relatively easily. They also have the benefit of being farmable but not that common, so this is a relatively good green item to get and one that you should definitely be selling. On the right we have the Shriveled Heart. Now this drops from Trash in Zul'Farrak, and it's fairly obvious as to why this is a bad item. It is a neck item, which at this level is quite rare. It gives a decent chunk of stamina, but it also gives negative stats, so it will actually be a detriment to your character to equip this item. Now that is not something that appeals to most, and it doesn't really have a use outside of equipping it as a detriment. It doesn't have a sell value to the vendor, and essentially just takes up bag space. So this is actually one of the few exceptions of a bad item that is so bad you can simply just throw it away. So that is obviously extreme examples of a good or bad item, but it's not always as clear as that. So we'll take a look at some examples that are a bit harder to determine next. So the next green that we're going to talk about is the Knight's Breastplate. Now this is just an example, it's any one of the vast majority of greens that you are going to get in the leveling process. It's just the example that I have chosen here to do this demonstration. Now, the Knight's Breastplate, like the vast majority of greens that you're going to get, is potentially a very good green item as well as a very bad green item. Now, this one is a level 34 male chest piece, but it can vary in its stats that it provides, which can make it either a good or bad green item. So if you were looking to sell this item on the auction house, you do need to consider who your target market that you are trying to sell it to would be. Now, given that this is pre-level 40 and it is male, if you were to look at this as though you were on the Horde side, that's going to limit you strictly to warriors. So, when we look at the warriors in that level bracket that are looking for a chest piece, they are going to want the stats that are of course good for warriors while they are leveling. So you are looking for things along the lines of spirit, strength, agility, stamina, things of that nature in a varying order depending on personal preference. A lot of people do get these stats wrong when they are leveling, so do bear that in mind when it comes to the potential selling of your green item. But for a lot of people, they are simply used to retail and want to get the primary stat that is good for their class from retail, so in the example of warriors, they're going to be wanting strength. In actuality, they'd be much better off with agility or spirit. So realistically, when it comes to you selling your random green item that you have acquired, if your item has on it any two of those three stats, chances are it's a very good green item and it's going to sell for a decent value and sell reasonably quickly. If, however, you were to get one that, let's say, was intellect, then that is of basically no use to anyone on the Horde side, as the only potential market for that is going to be a shaman after level 40, or potentially a paladin, but of course those are on alliance only. At which point then this item becomes a bad item. Now I'm going to throw up on the screen for you here all the different variants you can get of this item. And as you can see for yourself, there are both good and bad variants listed here. If you were, for example, to get of the tiger, in many people's opinion that is the best in slot green statement of animal suffix on your green item that you can get for the warrior example that we are using. But however, if you were to get of the eagle, that is probably the worst. Now, if you are to get a bad green item, that is not to say that it won't sell. Of course, you do have the potential for people to want to buy this item to disenchant in order to level up their skills, or maybe there's people who don't know what they're doing, or they have some sort of alternate reason for wanting to buy the item. Chances are, however, it will take longer to sell, and that you will get less value for it comparative to a good item, at which point it is then up to you whether it is worth the hassle of trying to sell it on the auction house and the potential costs of fees, over just vendoring the item for the difference that you're going to make in profit. Now, the last big point I want to make is that items do have a final thing to consider as to whether they are going to be good or bad items, and this one can be a little bit tricky and does require a pretty decent knowledge base. And I'm going to throw another example up for you here, and we'll try and determine from what we've already learned in this video whether it could be a good item or a bad item. So I'll throw it up now. Now, once again, we're using this example on our Horde side warrior like myself as to whether it's going to be a good or a bad item. And once again, this is a random stats item. So while it would seem fairly obvious that, again, two-handed sword at this level is warrior unique on the Horde side of things, then you would think that the same premise would apply, and it would be that strength and agility are going to make this a good item, and that if you were to get an intellect heavy item it wouldn't be as good. And while that is true, there is an extra factor that we need to consider here, and this factor is going to be the availability of alternatives. Now, when it comes to these two-handed weapons, particularly swords, which are unique to warriors at this level, as the only other really two-handed melee heavy class that you're going to have at this level is Enhancement Shaman, and they cannot use swords, at least again on the Horde side, then you are looking at those warriors and you need to be aware of what alternatives are available to them. Now, from level 30, warriors are able to get themselves the Whirlwind Axe. I'll throw that up on screen for you now as well. Now, as you can see, for anyone who is familiar with how warriors at this level work, the Whirlwind Axe is a substantially better weapon. As well as having the strength and stamina that a lot of warriors desire, it has a much higher damage per second, which is incredibly valuable for warriors, as well as an incredibly slow swing time, which again is incredibly good value for warriors. And it is also available 8 levels earlier, potentially, if you have the capacity to acquire it. Now, this is a relatively difficult weapon to acquire, but I will also throw up on the screen for you now. Now on screen for you is Ravager. Now Ravager is a considerably easier weapon to get your hands on than the Whirlwind Axe. It is also higher weapon damage per second and a slower weapon than the Headstriker sword, and is also got a relatively nice proc to it. Now this weapon is just a drop in a dungeon, and as a result is farmable and not all that difficult to get your hands on with a bit of luck and also a bit of determination. Now, given that both of these weapons are readily available and are also very well documented and well known about, does mean that the overwhelming majority of warriors at this level will have one of these weapons, if not both, depending on the circumstances that they're in, and this will result in a decrease in demand for the Headstriker sword if you were to have one, which means that this is unfortunately a lower standard of weapon, a lower standard of green item than it would first appear. Now, that is the final point that we want to cover here, just that you do need to bear in mind what alternatives are available for your green item that people might consider over purchasing the item that you are trying to sell. Now, all these examples have been fairly clear cut, but obviously that is for the sake of being able to make the video in a manner that people will understand. It's not always as simple as this. Sometimes green items are a little bit harder to perceive as to whether they are good or bad. Maybe you're not overly familiar with the stat priorities of every class or who's available to use it. But what I would say is that if you are ever in doubt as to whether a green item is good or not, then I would try and sell it. If the worst comes to the worst, if it fails once, if it doesn't sell, you can always consider vending it then, or however many attempts at selling you want to give it. But because of the increased value that you're going to get from selling it on the auction house the majority of the time, then I would say you're always better off at least attempting to sell it once, and then moving on from there. If nothing else, it will increase your knowledge base as to the level bracket of greens that you are trying to sell, and as to whether or not you may want to consider selling that item on the auction house in the future. But that's going to about do it for today, guys. I do hope you found this video informative. If you did, please do consider liking the video and or subscribing to the channel. It does mean a lot. But I hope to see you in the next one. Later.